The cake was still warm when she said it. I remember that more than anything else. Chocolate frosting melting at the edges, candles leaning like tired soldiers, my name written crooked but expensive. I had paid for everything. The hall, the food, the cake, even the flowers she posed with for pictures. I was standing near the table, holding a paper plate, smiling the way mothers do when they don't want to ruin the moment. That's when my daughter looked at me, not angry, not loud, just careless. "Go do the dishes." She said it like she was reminding me of my place, like the words had lived in her mouth for years, waiting for the right moment to come out. The room went quiet in a way only I noticed. Laughter continued around us. Phones were raised, someone clapped, someone else asked for more soda. No one looked at me. I felt my spine straighten before my heart could react. Old habit, years of learning how to stand still while something breaks inside you. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't remind her whose card paid for the evening. I picked up the plates. My hands moved automatically like they had been trained for this exact moment decades ago. Scrape, stack, walk, rinse, repeat. The sink water was too hot. I let it burn. It felt familiar. From the kitchen, I could hear my birthday being celebrated without me. Someone toasted her. Someone thanked her for organizing everything. Someone said, "You're such a good daughter." I watched my reflection in the stainless steel sink. An old woman, smiling out of habit, standing at a party she paid for, washing dishes like she didn't belong anywhere else. That night, I went home alone. No apology followed me, no explanation, just the quiet understanding that this wasn't new. But 2 days later, something shifted. Not in her, in me. I was not raised to ask for much. I was raised to notice what others needed before they asked. In the house where I grew up, love was quiet and work was loud. The women woke before the sun and slept after the last dish was dried. No one praised them. No one asked how they felt. Their reward was the house still standing, the children still breathing, the day survived. My mother used to say, "We'll rest later." Later never came. I learned early how to fold myself into usefulness, how to stand still when spoken over, how to listen more than I talked. I learned that being needed felt safer than being wanted because need didn't disappear when moods changed. When I was a girl, I dreamed of space. Not houses or money, just space. A chair that was mine, time that didn't belong to someone else. Silence without guilt. But life does not ask girls like me what we dream of. It asks what we can endure. I married young because it seemed like the next expected step, not because I was ready. He wasn't cruel at first. Just absent in ways that don't leave marks. He worked, he came home, he existed beside me without ever really seeing me. When I became pregnant, I remember placing my hand on my stomach and feeling something stir that felt like purpose. Not joy exactly, responsibility, a heavy, holy thing. When my daughter was born, the room filled with noise, doctors talking, nurses moving, machines beeping, but all I heard was her cry. Sharp, demanding, alive. I told myself, this is it. This is why. I did not know then how much of myself I would give away trying to be worthy of that sound. Motherhood didn't arrive gently. It came with hunger and exhaustion and fear that sat in my chest like a second heart. I learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the smallest noise. I learned how to stretch money, how to stretch patience, how to stretch myself. Her father drifted away slowly. Not one dramatic leaving, just more late nights, more excuses, more silence between us. When he finally left for good, there was no apology, just relief in his shoulders, like he had set something down he was tired of carrying. I carried it instead. I worked jobs that smelled like other people's lives. I cleaned floors that never remembered my name. I ironed shirts that belonged to men who went home to women who had help. I counted every dollar twice before spending it once. I learned which bills could wait and which ones couldn't. I learned how to smile at my daughter when my stomach was empty. She never knew how close things came sometimes. That was my job, to make sure she didn't know. I packed her lunches with care, cut sandwiches into shapes, added notes I pretended were casual but rewrote 3 times before slipping them in. I watched her sleep and memorized her face, afraid the world would change it too quickly. I wanted to be soft with her, but life made me firm. I said no when it hurt me. I said yes when it cost me. I stood in parent-teacher meetings feeling smaller than the chairs. I listened to people talk about potential and opportunity like they were things everyone had access to. At night, after she slept, I would sit at the table and let the quiet hit me. Some nights I cried. Some nights I just stared. Some nights I planned a future I didn't know how to reach. I told myself it was temporary. Everything hard is supposed to be temporary. Years passed that way, me giving, her growing, me adjusting, her expanding. I learned her moods, her silences, her hunger for more than I could offer. She was smart, quick, Sharp in ways I admired and feared. She asked questions I didn't always have answers to. She wanted things I had never touched. I wanted that for her, even when it scared me. I skipped doctor visits. I wore shoes too long. I stayed in jobs that bent my back and quieted my voice. I told myself it was noble. I told myself one day it would be worth it. People praised me for being strong. They never asked why I had to be. When she became a teenager, the distance began, not sudden, just noticeable. She wanted independence, and I gave it because I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung. I didn't realize how much of my identity was wrapped around being needed. She grew confident, outspoken, certain. I watched her become everything I never had room to be. I cheered loudly, even when it reminded me of what I had lost. Sometimes she spoke to me like I was behind the times. Sometimes she rolled her eyes when I worried. Sometimes she corrected me in front of others. I told myself it was normal. I told myself not to take it personally. Mothers learn how to swallow without choking. When she left for college, the house echoed. I walked from room to room touching walls like they might remember me. I packed her things carefully, folding pieces of myself into boxes she would never open again. She called less, then shorter, then only when she needed something. I told myself this was success. This was independence. This was what I had worked for, but at night, I lay awake wondering who I was without her schedule, her noise, her needs. I had given my youth without question, my energy without pause, my body without rest. And now, standing alone in a quiet house, I realized I had never practiced living for myself. I had practiced surviving for others. When she graduated, people congratulated me like I had crossed a finish line. They said things like, "You must be so proud," and I nodded because it was easier than explaining the emptiness pride didn't fill. She moved on, jobs, friends, a life that didn't orbit mine anymore, and I stayed, still working, still paying, still saying yes. I didn't resent her. Not truly. I resented the expectation that my role would never change, that my giving was endless, that my presence was permanent but my needs were optional. I looked at my hands one day and noticed how tired they looked. The skin thinner, the veins louder, the years written clearly where no one else bothered to read. I wondered when I had last done something simply because I wanted to. I couldn't remember. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with sadness. A deep, slow sadness that settled into my bones. I had loved fiercely. I had given honestly. I had endured quietly. And somewhere along the way, I had disappeared inside the role everyone praised me for playing. This wasn't regret. It was recognition. The early years had shaped me into someone reliable, dependable, invisible. Someone who didn't complain. Someone who didn't ask. Someone who knew how to hold everyone else together while quietly coming apart. I didn't know yet that this was the beginning of something else. I only knew that something inside me was tired of being strong in silence. And that tiredness, deep, honest, undeniable, was the first truth I had allowed myself in a very long time. Disappearing doesn't feel like vanishing. It feels like being left in the room after everyone else has moved on. At first, nothing looked different. The same phone calls came, just less often. The same visits happened, just shorter. The same words were used, busy, tired, later. I told myself this was adulthood. This was progress. This was what independence looked like when it grew teeth. But slowly, I noticed I was being edited out of my own life. Conversations changed tone. My opinions became interruptions. My concerns became exaggerations. My memories became stories people smiled through while checking their phones. I learned to pause before speaking, to weigh whether my words were worth the effort of being heard. Most of the time, they were. I wasn't excluded loudly. That would have hurt less. I was excluded gently, politely, in ways that left no evidence behind. Decisions were made without me, then explained afterward as if they were whether unavoidable, impersonal, already past. I would hear about trips after they returned, about gatherings I hadn't known existed, about changes that affected me but didn't require my input. And every time, I told myself not to read into it. But erasure doesn't announce itself, it settles. I began to notice how people spoke around me instead of to me, how questions directed at me were really invitations to agree. How my silence was interpreted as consent, not consideration. My daughter grew sharper with her words, not cruel, just efficient. She spoke to me the way people speak to systems that are expected to function, not feel. Can you watch this? Can you handle that? You don't mind, right? And I didn't. Or at least I didn't say I did. I learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced, because being useful was still safer than being honest. I arrived early and left quietly. I cleaned up messes that weren't mine. I offered help that wasn't asked for. People thank me the way you thank furniture for holding weight. At family gatherings, I became background noise, the one who refilled drinks, the one who found extra chairs, the one who watched coats and purses while conversations happened elsewhere. I stood near walls more often. Walls don't expect anything. I watched my daughter move through rooms like she belonged everywhere, confident, certain, surrounded by people who listened when she spoke. I felt pride and something else I didn't want to name. I remembered when she used to search for my face first in a crowd. Now she assumed I would be somewhere behind her, taking care of things. I told myself this was success. I told myself this was what I raised her for. But sometimes, late at night, I would replay moments where I had been spoken over, corrected, dismissed. Moments where my presence had been tolerated but not required. I wondered when my voice had started to sound unnecessary. There were times I tried to speak up. Small times, careful times. I would mention feeling left out or tired or unsure. The response was always gentle, always reasonable. You're overthinking. You're too sensitive. That's not what I meant. Those words are clean. They leave no bruise, so I stopped trying. I adjusted instead. I shrank my expectations. I rehearsed silence. I learned the relief of being agreeable. I learned how to nod while feeling hollow. People called me easygoing. They said I was low maintenance. They praised my strength. No one asked what it cost. I started forgetting myself in small ways, forgetting to eat on time, forgetting appointments, forgetting what I liked. My world narrowed to obligations and routines. I still worked, still paid bills, still showed up when asked, but something essential had gone quiet inside me. I would sit alone in my house and realize entire days had passed without anyone needing my thoughts, my laughter, my presence. I was useful only when summoned, and I answered every summons. My daughter's life expanded. Mine stayed the same. She spoke about plans that didn't include me, futures that assumed my flexibility, choices that depended on my availability. She didn't ask if I was tired. She assumed I was. Sometimes she spoke to me with impatience, like I was slowing things down, like I was an obstacle to efficiency. And each time I swallowed the ache because confronting it felt like risking the only connection I had left. I told myself love required tolerance. I told myself endurance was devotion. But deep down, I felt something shifting. A dull awareness that I was being preserved, not cherished. Kept, not considered. I watched families on television where mothers were listened to, consulted, valued. I scoffed, told myself it was fiction, but the image lingered longer than I expected. I began to question things I had never questioned before: why my time was always available, why my needs were always postponed, why my role had never evolved beyond service. I noticed how people assumed I would adjust, move dates, change plans, make room. I noticed how rarely anyone adjusted for me. The world had learned that I would bend, and it bent me often. I didn't blame my daughter entirely. I had taught her this language. I had taught her that I was steady, flexible, endlessly capable. I had never taught her what it looked like when I was tired of carrying everything alone, because I didn't know how to say it. I feared that if I stopped giving, there would be nothing left to connect us, that my worth had become transactional, measured by what I provided, not who I was. That fear kept me quiet longer than anything else. I remember one particular afternoon. She came over briefly, distracted, phone in hand. She spoke to me while scrolling, nodding occasionally. I said something, nothing important, and she didn't hear me. I repeated it. She waved me off. Later, Mom. Later never came. After she left, I sat at the table and stared at the empty chair across from me. I imagined myself sitting there as a younger woman, hopeful, exhausted, certain that love would eventually circle back. I realized then that I had been waiting my whole life for recognition that was never promised. And that realization hurt more than any argument could have. I wasn't angry. I was grieving. Grieving the woman I had been before I learned how to disappear. Grieving the mother I thought I would be in her eyes forever. Grieving the assumption that love naturally deepens with time. Sometimes it thins. I began to feel invisible even when I was physically present. Like a shadow people stepped around without noticing. I learned the sound of my own name being used less often. I learned the difference between being invited and being included. Inclusion requires intention. Invitation requires politeness. I got many invitations, very little intention. I wondered if this was aging. If this was what happened when women outlived their usefulness in other people's stories. If we were meant to fade gracefully, quietly, without complaint. But something inside me resisted that idea. Not loudly, just steadily. I started noticing how much energy it took to stay silent. How heavy my chest felt after gatherings. How relief washed over me when I was alone, not because I preferred solitude, but because solitude didn't demand performance. In silence, I didn't have to be grateful. I didn't have to be agreeable. I didn't have to be useful. I could just exist. And that frightened me more than being erased, because existence without function felt unfamiliar, unjustified, almost forbidden. Still, the awareness grew, slow and undeniable. I was disappearing not because I was unwanted, but because I had made it easy. I had trained everyone around me to see me as permanent infrastructure, not a living, changing person. And infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. I didn't know yet what would come next. I only knew that the quiet inside me was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. And something that heavy cannot stay buried forever. Being left behind doesn't come with an announcement. It arrives disguised as independence. At first, I told myself this was normal. Children grow up, lives separate. Mothers learn to step back. That's what everyone says, and everyone says it like it doesn't hurt. But what they don't tell you is how quiet the house becomes. Not peaceful quiet, hollow quiet. The kind that makes you aware of every clock, every creak, every breath you take alone. When my daughter finally moved out for good, I stood in the doorway long after her car disappeared. I didn't wave. I didn't cry. I just stood there holding the frame like it might anchor me. Inside, her room still smelled faintly like her shampoo. I didn't clean it right away. I couldn't. The bed was made too neatly, like she might come back and undo it herself. The posters were gone, but the nail holes remained, tiny reminders that something once lived there. I walked into that room sometimes just to remind myself that I hadn't imagined the years, that I hadn't dreamed an entire life into existence. People asked me how I felt. I said I was fine. People praised me for being strong. I let them. Strength is easier than honesty. The days stretched differently after that. There was no one else's schedule to follow, no meals to time, no footsteps to listen for. I woke up and realized no one needed me immediately. That realization felt like falling. I tried to fill the time, took on extra shifts, rearranged furniture, cleaned things that were already clean. I told myself I was organizing, but really I was searching for proof that I still mattered somewhere. At night, loneliness crept in slowly. Not like a scream, but like a draft you don't notice until you're cold. I would sit on the couch, television on but unwatched, and feel the weight of my own presence pressing back at me. I had spent so many years being useful that I didn't know how to just be. The world did not collapse without me, and that truth hurt more than I expected. I noticed how people spoke to me now. Less urgency, less expectation, less need. I was still included, but my role had shifted. I was optional. Optional is a dangerous word when you've built your life on necessity. I started questioning everything. Who was I if no one needed me? What was my value if I wasn't solving, supporting, sustaining? Those questions followed me into sleep and woke me up early in the mornings. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the light change, feeling like a guest in my own life. Some days I didn't speak at all. I would go an entire afternoon without hearing my own voice. When I finally did speak, to a cashier, to myself, it sounded unfamiliar, like a sound unused. I missed my daughter in ways I didn't want to admit. Not the adult version who spoke quickly and checked her phone, but the child who needed me, who believed I was the center of her world. I knew that version was gone. I didn't want her back, but I grieved her anyway. Loneliness teaches you uncomfortable things. It shows you the habits you've been hiding behind, the ways you avoid yourself, the ways you've mistaken endurance for purpose. I began to notice how tired I was, not physically, emotionally. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with rest. The kind that comes from carrying too much alone for too long. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes looked older than I felt. Her shoulders were always slightly raised, like she was bracing for something. I realized then that I had never relaxed into my own life. I had always been on standby. That thought scared me. I started walking in the evenings. Nothing dramatic, just around the block. I wanted to feel my body moving for my own sake, not because I was rushing to meet someone else's need. At first, it felt selfish. Wrong, like I was wasting time I should be giving away. But slowly, the walks became something I looked forward to. The air felt different when no one was waiting for me. I noticed things, trees I had never really seen, windows glowing softly, people living entire lives I would never know. It reminded me that the world was bigger than the roles I had played. Still, the loneliness didn't disappear. It sat beside me patient, but it changed shape. It became less sharp, more reflective. Instead of asking, "Why am I alone?" it started asking, "Who am I now?" That question didn't have an answer yet. There were nights I cried without knowing why. Not sobbing. Just tears falling quietly, like my body was releasing something my mind hadn't caught up to. I thought about the years I had postponed myself, dreams I had labeled impractical, desires I had buried under responsibility. I realized how many choices I had made automatically, without asking if they were still right for me. I wasn't angry at my daughter. Not really. She had done what children are meant to do: grow, leave, live. What I was angry at was the idea that my life was supposed to end quietly once my usefulness ran out. I began to resist that idea, gently at first. I rearranged my days, not to be productive, but to be intentional. I read books slowly. I cooked meals just for myself and ate them at the table instead of standing at the sink. I let the house stay messy sometimes. I let the phone ring without answering. These were small rebellions, but they felt enormous. Still, the ache remained, especially during holidays, especially during moments that reminded me of how easily I had been replaced by other priorities. I attended family gatherings and noticed how I hovered at the edges now, how conversations moved on without me, how my presence was assumed but not required. That realization no longer shocked me. It clarified me. I began to understand that being left behind had forced me into a space I had avoided my whole life, myself. There was grief there, deep grief, for the woman I had been before motherhood consumed me, for the years I had given away without question, for the belief that love would automatically return what I invested. But there was also something else, something quieter. Freedom scared me because I didn't know what to do with it, but it also whispered possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. I didn't chase those possibilities yet. I just acknowledged them. Some nights, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. Each light belonged to someone else's life, someone else's story. And for the first time, I wondered what my story could be if I stopped living it for others. That question didn't demand an answer. It just waited. And in that waiting, I felt something unfamiliar take root, not joy, not excitement, but awareness. I was still here. I was still breathing. And my life was not over just because someone else had moved on. Being left behind had stripped me of distraction. It had exposed the quiet truth I had avoided for decades. I had never chosen myself. Not once. I didn't know how to do it yet. I only knew that the loneliness had opened a door I could no longer pretend wasn't there. And somewhere in that quiet, unclaimed space, something inside me began to stand up. Slowly, carefully, without asking permission, the penthouse didn't arrive as a dream. It arrived as a decision. I didn't wake up one morning wanting something high above the city. I woke up tired of living low inside myself. For years, I had learned how to live in spaces that were too small for me, rooms filled with other people's expectations, corners where I placed myself so I wouldn't disturb anyone else's comfort. I told myself space was a luxury, not a need. But one afternoon, sitting alone in my quiet house, I realized something simple and unsettling. No one was coming back to make room for me, so I made it myself. I didn't tell anyone at first. I looked quietly, walked through places with wide windows and clean lines, places that felt open, not apologetic. When I stepped into the penthouse, I felt something loosen in my chest. Light poured in without asking permission. The air felt still but alive. No one else's history clung to the walls. It wasn't about wealth. I had lived long enough to know money doesn't heal wounds. It was about ownership, about choosing something because it fit me, not because it was practical for others. When I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I had spent a lifetime hesitating. This time, I didn't. I moved slowly, carefully. Each box unpacked felt like a quiet declaration. I arranged furniture the way I liked it, not the way it was supposed to look. I bought curtains because I wanted softness, not because anyone else approved. The first night there, I slept deeply. No waiting, no listening, no bracing. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The news reached my daughter the way things always do, casually. A comment from someone else. A passing mention. I heard the shift in her voice before I heard the words. "A penthouse," she said. There was surprise there and something else. She didn't ask why, she asked how big. The questions came quickly after that: where it was, how many rooms, how long I planned to stay there. Her curiosity felt less like interest and more like assessment. Then came the suggestions. "You know, it makes sense if it would be easier if, you don't need all that space." She spoke like my decision was temporary. Like my space was still negotiable. I didn't correct her right away. Old habits die slowly. I listened, I nodded. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. They visited not long after. She brought her tone with her, light, practical, efficient. Her eyes moved through the space quickly, cataloging, measuring. She commented on the view, on the furniture, on what could be changed. She spoke about staying over, about storage, about convenience. She never asked if I wanted company. Standing there in the home I had chosen for myself, I felt something rise that I had never fully allowed before. Not anger, not resentment, clarity. I realized then that she hadn't returned because she missed me. She had returned because she saw access, because she assumed my life would always bend around hers. I had taught her that lesson well. The entitlement wasn't loud. It didn't shout or demand. It assumed. That was worse. She spoke of family space and shared living like those words erased years of absence, like proximity could replace presence. I watched her move through my home as if it were already partly hers, and something in me went still. That night, after she left, I sat alone on the couch and let the quiet settle. I thought about all the times I had adjusted, all the times I had made space for others while standing on the edges of my own life. I thought about the birthday, the dishes, the commands spoken without malice because malice wasn't necessary. That memory sat heavy in my chest. 2 days later she called. Her voice was relaxed, familiar. She spoke about logistics, about timing, about how it would work better if she had access to the penthouse, if she stayed sometimes, if she kept things there. She spoke as if the decision had already been made. I listened without interrupting. My heart beat slowly, evenly. That surprised me too. When she paused, waiting for agreement, I took a breath. No, I said, just that. There was silence on the line, the kind that feels unfinished. No, she repeated like she hadn't heard correctly. I'm not doing that, I said. This is my space. The words didn't come out angry. They came out steady. She laughed lightly as if I were joking. Then her tone shifted, confused, slightly offended. Why not? She asked. It makes sense. It made sense to her because my boundaries had never mattered before. I didn't explain myself, I didn't justify, I didn't list my sacrifices, I didn't remind her of the years I had spent bending. I just said, I need this to be mine. The line went quiet again. She didn't argue loudly. She didn't cry. She went cold, polite, controlled. She said she understood, but the words landed hollow. After we hung up, I sat with the feeling. It wasn't relief. It wasn't guilt. It was unfamiliar neutrality. For the first time, I had not rushed to fix discomfort that wasn't mine. In the days that followed, the distance grew, calls slowed, messages shortened. I could feel the withdrawal of warmth, the subtle punishment of withheld closeness. It hurt. Of course it did. But it didn't break me. I had spent a lifetime absorbing emotional consequences for having needs. This time, I let them exist without rushing to undo them. I walked through my penthouse and felt the space differently now. It wasn't just mine physically, it was mine emotionally. No one else's expectations clung to it yet. I realized how rare that was. I missed my daughter in moments. I wondered if I had gone too far. Those thoughts came late at night, familiar and persuasive. But then I remembered the sink, the plates, the way my presence had been dismissed without hesitation. And I stayed still. Entitlement is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's comfort grown careless. Sometimes it's love that assumes access without responsibility. I understood that now. I didn't stop loving her, but I stopped shrinking for her. Weeks passed. The tension remained unspoken. At family gatherings, conversations stayed polite, surface level. I was no longer leaned on, no longer assumed. And that absence hurt less than I thought it would, because I was finally standing somewhere solid. The penthouse became my refuge. Not from her, but from the version of myself that believed love required self-erasure. I sat by the windows often, watching the city move. I felt old and young at the same time, tired and awake. I didn't feel victorious. I felt honest. This wasn't about punishment. It was about preservation. I had reached the point where losing myself was no longer an option I could afford, and if that meant being misunderstood, so be it. I had lived too long being perfectly understood as someone who would always give. Now I was something else. Someone who chose. The quiet after you choose yourself is different from loneliness. It doesn't ache the same way. It doesn't beg. It simply exists. At first, I mistook it for emptiness. I would sit in my living room, the city humming outside my windows, and wait for something to happen. A call, a knock, a reason to move. Old habits don't disappear just because you finally see them for what they are. I was used to reacting, responding, adjusting. Stillness felt irresponsible. Days passed, then weeks. The silence from my daughter didn't grow dramatic, it grew normal. That hurt in a quieter way, not sharp, not loud, just steady. We spoke occasionally. Polite words, safe topics, weather, health, schedules, the language of people who don't want to touch the real thing because they're not sure what it will cost. I learned to sit with that. There were moments, small, sudden ones, when grief surprised me. I would see a woman holding her mother's arm on the street, hear laughter that sounded like hers. Remember the weight of my daughter's head on my shoulder when she was young and tired. Those memories didn't disappear just because I had drawn a boundary. They stayed. They softened and hardened at the same time. Love doesn't leave when dignity arrives. It just changes shape. Some mornings, I woke early and watched the light move across the floor. I noticed how the apartment held sound differently, how my footsteps belonged only to me, how nothing here waited for me to explain myself. I made breakfast slowly. I drank my tea while it was still hot. I let silence stretch without filling it. That felt radical. I realized how often I had rushed my own life before. Rushed meals, rushed rest, rushed joy, as if lingering too long would inconvenience someone else. Now no one was waiting. The world did not collapse because I stopped bending. It adjusted, quietly, without apology. I thought about my mother often during that time, about the way she had faded without complaint, about how her sacrifices were remembered as character traits, not losses. She was strong, people said. They never said she was tired. I wondered what her life might have felt like if she had ever chosen herself, even briefly, if she had ever said no and let the silence follow. That thought stayed with me. There were days I felt old in a way that had nothing to do with years, old with experience, old with knowing, old with acceptance. And there were days I felt strangely young, like I had arrived late to my own life but arrived nonetheless. I did not suddenly become fearless. I still questioned myself, still replayed conversations, still wondered if I had done the right thing. But the questions no longer ruled me. I understood something essential then. Regret and peace can exist in the same room. They do not cancel each other out. I regretted the distance. I did not regret the boundary. Sometimes I imagined what my daughter might say about me now, that I had changed, that I was stubborn, that I was distant. All of those things might be true, but they were not worse than disappearing. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be. I learned that clarity doesn't always bring comfort to others, and that isn't a failure. My phone rang less. Invitations came differently. I was no longer the default solution, and with that loss came an unexpected lightness. I began to notice my body again, how it felt to rest without guilt, how tension left my shoulders when I stopped anticipating other people's needs. I slept deeper, not perfectly, but honestly. There were nights I dreamed of my daughter as a child. In those dreams, she still reached for me. I would wake with a heaviness in my chest and remind myself that love doesn't disappear just because access changes. I held both truths carefully. I did not chase reconciliation. I did not demand it either. I let things remain unresolved. Unresolved doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it means real. I stopped trying to be understood by everyone. I focused instead on being truthful with myself. That was harder and more important. I learned what kinds of days suited me. I learned what drained me. I learned how much noise I could tolerate. I learned that my preferences mattered even if no one else noticed them. Especially then. Some afternoons, I sat by the window and watched the city move below me. People rushing, people colliding, people living in ways that had nothing to do with me. That anonymity felt freeing. I was not needed. I was not required. I was simply present. And presence, I learned, is not empty. There were moments of doubt. Of course there were. Moments when I wondered if being alone was a punishment I had chosen for myself. Moments when I wondered if strength had cost me something irreplaceable. But then I remembered the sink, the birthday, the command, and I understood that staying silent would have cost me more. I did not harden. I softened inward. I stopped begging the world to see me and started seeing myself instead. That didn't make life easier. It made it truer. I still love my daughter. That love is quieter now, less performative, less self-sacrificing. It exists without demanding anything in return. That kind of love is lonely sometimes, but it is honest. I do not know what the future holds for us. I do not write endings anymore. I let things unfold at their own pace. What I know is this: I no longer confuse endurance with devotion. I no longer confuse silence with peace. I have learned that choosing yourself does not feel like victory. It feels like alignment, like finally standing where your feet have been trying to take you for years. Some nights, the city lights blur through my window and I feel a familiar ache. Not regret, not sorrow. Memory, I let it sit beside me. I do not rush to fix it. Because this life, quiet, imperfect, unresolved, is mine. And for the first time, I am not apologizing for taking up space in it.